Okay. So there's a few broader principles in terms of, well, look, AusAID used the term development through sport. The Australian Sports Commission uses the term sport for development. I don't think there's any need to get caught up in terminology. The main point is that we're trying to use sport to achieve these development outcomes. So, but really simply, the main principles that AusAID cares about are first partnerships. Like AusAID recognises that sports are not development agencies. It's not their core business. So sport organisations should be doing their core business, training coaches, getting people playing sport, training officials, that kind of thing. And then finding ways to either use those programs to strengthen the existing initiatives in these other areas that AusAID's working in. So AusAID has investments in these areas as well. So looking at ways of linking with the existing investments and possibly strengthening the activities that AusAID's delivering out there in the Pacific. Or alternatively, working with some development partners. They might be non-government or government partners who their core business is the development side of things. So their core business might be health promotion. Their core business might be, promoting the rights of people with disabilities. So I guess the take-home message is that AusAID doesn't expect the sports to do that, but does expect that they are the outcomes we want to achieve, and you might need to actually look at how you work with those with partners to achieve those. So branding, the Australian, like AusAID has sort of recognised that a lot of the programs and activities that are being delivered out there in the Pacific or internationally perhaps don't get the recognition for the Australian government, and a large part of the Australian aid program is promoting Australia's interests overseas. And so, and I'm not, given that I am from the Commission originally, so I'm not going to speak with a great deal of authority on this, but sport's a really good way of branding the Australian government's effort. Last year or the year before, AusAID brought out this new logo to try to raise the profile of the aid program. And so for those programs that are out there, the AusAID's always looking for opportunities to get the Australian aid brand out there. So sport's probably a really good way of doing that. Evidence is a huge thing. So more broadly, as I sort of said before, sport is not really a key focus in terms of a sectoral area within AusAID. What I've noticed in working in the Pacific area is that people love sport. Like within AusAID, they love sport, and we report to a parliamentary secretary for Pacific Island Affairs, and they generally are very supportive of sport. But sport's really seen as a public diplomacy, a way of promoting AusAID's work as opposed to a legitimate development sort of modality. So if, and this is certainly the focus of the Sports Commission and the AusAID policy area with this joint strategy, to just build the evidence base to demonstrate that sport should be a long-term investment within Australia's aid program. So the evidence should really focus on objectives and outcomes, not outputs. So there's a lot of strange words there, and a lot of debates over which is which. But essentially what it means is, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, but sports generally are interested in participation rates, numbers of coaches trained, people, competitions being run, that sort of thing. AusAID just doesn't care about that stuff. Those statistics are good. They can be used to like educate people within AusAID and outside of AusAID about what we're doing, but largely it's the objectives, the human development outcomes that AusAID's interested in. So even though sports are really focused on that the participation levels, that is of only sort of vague interest to AusAID. And the fourth area is just communication. So AusAID administers Australia's aid program on behalf of the Australian government. So AusAID's always looking for opportunities to inform key stakeholders, and the main key stakeholder for the Australian aid program is the Australian public. So the opportunity to communicate with the Australian public, so that's in annual reports, that's on the website, through AusAID's social media. AusAID's really intent on advertising the impact, the social impacts of sport. So, what AusAID wants to hear, and this has been sort of interesting from working within AusAID, is that in the short term, what AusAID wants to hear is a human story. In the long term, the human story backed by evidence, right? So, in many ways, sport and through the PSP is in a kind of good position. It's a little bit under the radar in terms of having real, having people really put the magnifying glass on it as a modality. It is generally supported within AusAID, certainly across the different countries that are working in the Pacific. They all love sport. But I think more broadly, in the longer term, for it to become like a recognised modality, it needs to be backed by evidence. To really get people to take sport seriously, it really needs to be backed by hard evidence. But it doesn't have to be too complicated, I don't believe. And certainly in talking with people within AusAID about the kinds of things that they like to hear, they actually just want to hear some of these really basic human change stories, things like people getting healthier and losing weight, people with disabilities getting more involved in the community, leadership and opportunities and inclusion of girls and women, communities coming together. They're the kinds of key messages which are, sport's just really well placed to provide evidence that it's achieving those things. And that's the kind of stuff that pretty much people within AusAID, from my experience, like to hear. And they like to, sport's just a really good way of showing it. Certainly some of the videos that we've seen from those sports that have been involved in the first phase of PSP that have sent through, they've come through to me, and I've popped them around to people throughout the division, and they just love them. So, but I think the long term, there needs to be hard evidence so sport becomes seen as a legitimate tool. So, well, look, I'd like to just wrap up by saying, certainly from working at the Commission and delivering these programs, and then going and working with an AusAID, which is sort of, I guess, I viewed it previously as this big fortress on the hill. It's a big bureaucracy. Sorry, I've got one more slide. I'll come back to that. It is a big bureaucracy. It's a process-driven organisation. It's responsible for the effective delivery of Australia's aid program. So the real role of AusAID is to assure the quality of programs being delivered, and it relies on working with partners like the Sports Commission then, who engage with the sports to deliver the activities. I don't think there's a lot of pressure on the sports to necessarily get it right from the beginning. But certainly within the Pacific Division of the people I speak to, I think there is a real focus on getting people delivering activities to be constantly reviewing what they're doing. So not necessarily thinking that you have to get it right from the beginning, but get it started and then get it right along the way. Although Marty might have more to say about that later. So in terms of this actual PSP and the role AusAID will play, firmly in the back seat, but ultimately accountable. So AusAID's accountable for the funding that goes into this. So we hold the Sports Commission accountable. There are these fairly comprehensive quality assurance processes that ultimately my director is the one who has to report back within AusAID on how things are going. So ultimately, the program area, the Pacific Division where I'm working at the moment, is responsible for the funding, providing assistance to the Sports Commission in terms of child protection, doing health, disabilities, sorts of areas, but also just the quality assurance side of things, so making sure that the programs are being run effectively, efficiently, they're relevant, and being monitored. There's probably no real need for the sports themselves won't have a lot to do with AusAID, although it would be worthwhile, I would say, if the sports are out there in the Pacific, to work closely with the Sports Commission, especially in the countries where we have a country program, to form a relationship with AusAID, just so to keep them updated on what's going on. But really, AusAID had a very strong role in the design of the program to get the funding approved so it could go ahead. But now we're sort of handballing it over to the Sports Commission, and we'll have maintain a relationship with the Sports Commission, essentially feeding back the information which the sports are feeding back to the Commission on the progress of the activities and the impact they're having. So that's about it from AusAID's perspective. Thanks.